The room was filled with people, but something about it felt incomplete, not visibly, not in a way that could be immediately pointed to, but in a way that could be felt if one paid close enough attention, because there are moments where presence is not equal awareness, where people exist within a space without truly occupying it, moving, speaking, reacting, yet not fully there. And that was a strange quality that lingered in the room that day, a kind of silent disconnection hidden beneath ordinary behavior, and most did not notice it, because it is difficult to recognize something that has always been normal, and what is normal rarely invites scrutiny, but at the center of that space stood Friedrich Nietzsche, not observing in the way others observed, not reacting the way others reacted, but watching in a way that suggested he was seeing something different entirely, something beneath the surface, something that others either could not see or chose not to see, and that difference created tension, not immediately, not openly, but subtly, because when one person begins to see differently, it introduces a quiet instability into a space built on shared perception. And shared perception is what keeps people comfortable because it confirms that what they experience is real. And when that confirmation is disrupted, even slightly, discomfort begins to form, and discomfort, when left without explanation, often turns into resistance, and resistance seeks expression, and expression eventually takes form. And that form arrived when one of the men stepped forward, his tone casual, almost dismissive, asking what Nietzsche found so interesting, what exactly he believed he was seeing that others were not. And the question carried a hint of challenge, but also something else, something less obvious, something closer to unease, because people do not like being observed in ways they do not understand. And Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence, brief as it was, changed the tone of the moment, because silence, when placed between question and answer, creates weight, and weight forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, almost indifferent to the reaction it might produce. And he said that the most unsettling thing about people is not what they do, but how little of it is truly their own. And the words did not land as an accusation. They landed as something more ambiguous, something that required interpretation. And the room reacted not with immediate rejection, but with confusion, because the statement did not align with any clear structure. And when something does not align, the mind tries to correct it, to reshape it into something familiar. And one of the men laughed, lightly at first, then louder, as if the statement itself were absurd, as if the idea that people are not fully themselves was something too distant from reality to be taken seriously. And the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it was easier than confronting something unclear. And Nietzsche did not react, did not challenge the laughter, did not defend his statement. And that lack of reaction created something unexpected, because when a man does not respond to dismissal, the dismissal begins to lose its force, and the laughter, though still present, began to feel less stable, less certain, as if it required reinforcement to sustain itself. And one of the men stepped forward again, this time more directly, asking what Nietzsche meant, asking whether he was suggesting that people were somehow false, that their actions, their beliefs, their decisions were not real. And Nietzsche looked at him, not with intensity, not with confrontation, but with a kind of quiet clarity, and said that most people do not act, they repeat, they do not think, they reflect what they have been given. And the words moved differently this time, because they were more precise, more direct, and the room felt it not as agreement, but as disruption, because now the statement had taken form. And form is harder to ignore, and the tension that followed was no longer subtle. It was present, visible in the way people shifted, in the way attention narrowed, in the way the room, once casual, became focused, and something had begun. The laughter did not disappear immediately, but it changed, becoming uneven, less certain, as if it were no longer sustained by confidence but by habit. And habit, once exposed, begins to lose its strength, because it no longer feels natural. It feels repeated, and repetition, when seen clearly, creates distance between a person and what they are doing. And that distance is where awareness begins, and awareness is what the crowd had not expected, because they had come to dismiss, to react, to move past the moment quickly, but instead they found themselves held within it, unable to fully return to the rhythm they had before. And that alone was enough to create discomfort, because a disrupted rhythm is difficult to restore without effort, and effort reveals what once felt automatic. And once something automatic requires effort, it becomes visible, and what becomes visible can be questioned. And questioning is something the crowd was not prepared for, not in that moment, not in that space. And one of the men stepped forward again, this time without laughter, his voice lower, more controlled, asking what Nietzsche meant more precisely, asking whether he was claiming that people had no individuality, that their actions, their thoughts, their decisions were nothing more than reflections of something external. And the question carried resistance, but also something else, something less visible, something closer to unease, because the statement had begun to settle, not as an idea, but as a possibility. And possibilities are far more difficult to dismiss than arguments, because they do not require agreement to exist. And Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that most people believe they are choosing, but what they call choice is often nothing more than a continuation of what they have been taught, shaped long before they became aware of it. And the words moved differently this time, because they did not attack directly. They redefined something that had always felt certain, and redefining something familiar creates instability, because it forces a person to reconsider what they have always accepted without question, and that reconsideration is not comfortable. It does not resolve quickly, it lingers, it creates tension, and the room felt that tension begin to spread, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now each person present had been pulled into the statement, not as an observer, but as a subject, and being a subject removes distance. And without distance, resistance becomes harder to maintain. And Nietzsche continued, saying that people often mistake repetition for identity, that they inherit patterns, beliefs, reactions, and then defend them as if they were their own, without ever asking where they came from. And the words settled into the room with a kind of quiet weight, because they did not demand immediate reaction. They demanded reflection. And reflection is slower, heavier, more difficult to avoid, and the man who had spoken did not respond immediately. And that hesitation revealed something that had not been present before, because early reactions had been quick, almost automatic, but now something had interrupted that automatic response. Something had slowed it down, and once thought is slowed, it begins to deepen, and depth is where discomfort grows. And Nietzsche, seeing this, did not press harder, did not escalate, because the moment had already shifted, and escalation would have broken what had begun to form. And instead, he said that the most dangerous thing is not that people are influenced, but that they are unaware of how deeply that influence runs, because what is unseen feels like self, and what feels like self is rarely questioned. And the words moved through the room quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of persistence that made them difficult to ignore. And the people around him did not laugh now, not because they agreed, but because something had changed in the way they heard. And when the way something is heard changes, everything that follows is different. And the room, once held together by shared certainty, now held something else entirely, something unstable, something unresolved, something that no longer responded to simple dismissal. And within that shift, something had already begun to break, even if no one was ready to admit it, because what they were feeling was not confusion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that what they had always called themselves might not have been entirely their own. And for the first time, the room was no longer certain, but it had not yet understood what that uncertainty would lead to. The room did not react all at once. It held. But what remained was no longer the same, because something had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily pointed to, but inwardly, in a quiet space where thought begins to separate from habit. And once that separation begins, it cannot be undone simply by return to what was there before, because what was there before had already been seen differently. And once something is seen differently, it loses its ability to feel the same. And that was what had changed, not the people themselves, not their positions, not their words, but the way those things were now being experienced. And that difference was enough to create something far more unsettling than disagreement. It created awareness. And awareness does not comfort, it disrupts, because it forces a person to confront what they had previously accepted without question. And the people in the room felt it, even if they did not fully understand it, because something had been introduced that could not be easily dismissed, something that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they saw themselves. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood within that space, not as someone who had imposed anything upon them, but as someone who had revealed something that had always been. There, hidden beneath repetition, beneath habit, beneath the quiet assumption that what feels familiar must be true. And one of the men spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, asking what it means if what they believe is not entirely their own. And the question carried something new, Not challenge, not resistance, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it emerges when something real has been touched. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that what it means is that most people have never truly examined themselves, that they live within patterns they did not create, guided by thoughts they did not choose, and defend them as if they were essential to who they are. And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and revelation is far more difficult to resist because it does not force agreement. It creates recognition, and recognition is something that cannot be easily undone once it begins. And the room fell silent, but this silence was not empty. It was filled with something heavier, something that pressed inward rather than outward, because now each person present had been left alone with a question they could not easily escape, whether the life they were living was truly theirs, or simply a continuation of something they had never questioned. And Nietzsche spoke once more, his voice steady, saying that the most dangerous illusion is not what people are told, but what they come to believe without ever asking. Why? Because once something becomes part of the self, it is protected, defended, and rarely examined. And that is how a person can live an entire life without ever becoming truly aware of it. And the words settled into the room with finality, not as an argument, but as something that could not be easily dismissed, and no one responded. Because there was no response that could restore what had been there before, no argument that could return a moment to its earlier simplicity. And Nietzsche turned and walked away, not slowly, not dramatically, but with the same calm presence he carried from the beginning. And as he moved, no one stopped him, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already shifted, something that could not be undone through reaction alone. And as he disappeared from view, the room remained, but it was no longer the same, because once a person begins to question what feels natural, what feels automatic, what feels like self, they cannot fully return to the state before that question existed. And what remained was not silence, but something far more unsettling. The quiet awareness that the line between who they were and what they had been given was not as clear as they had always believed, and that awareness does not leave easily. The room did not react all at once. It held, but what remained was no longer the same.